Hello everyone and welcome to the 21st in our ongoing series of lectures on Middle Egyptian and hieroglyphics. Today we will be covering the so-called second tense. Now, first of all, yes, I said I was going away indefinitely. It turns out I actually do get time on winter break, enough to make a couple of videos. It also helps that I have moved along far enough in my studies that I actually understand the topic of the video. Had I attempted to make this 5 months ago, I simply would not have been able to produce a coherent video on the topic, and I think no one would have gotten anything out of that. This is the main topic of chapter 12 in Hoax Grammar. Now, you'll notice I skipped chapter 11. Not actually, it's just that chapter 11 contains mostly miscellaneous material. I have decided to group 11, 12, and 13 together because that will give us the last two major verb forms and let us kind of intermix the more minor stuff that happens in chapters 11, 12, and 13, of which there is a great deal, together in a more understandable fashion. I'm not saying that hoax order is wrong for a textbook, it's just for lecture videos, it doesn't really work out great to do it in the literal order here. So the second tense is kind of an awful name for this verb form that we are going to be dealing with. Second tense doesn't actually mean anything in the context of ancient Egyptian. In particular, it's not a tense. It's a form of a verb, but there are multiple tenses within it. And also, there's no first tense or first anything really, other than maybe you could talk about the first perspective being related to it, i.e. just the regular perspective. People have proposed other names. Hoax cites manner nominalization, but that doesn't really mean all that much. My apologies about that. My cat has just stepped on the keyboard. My personal preferred name for it is the nominal indicative. This is to contrast it with the perspective, which is also known as the subjunctive, or really the nominal subjunctive, because it is a nominal form. But really, the fundamental problem is that this form, it does things that do not correlate super well into English, or into the other languages that we borrow our grammar terms from, like French or Latin. And therefore, we don't have any easy way to immediately describe what it does. What it does in particular is emphasize an adverbial element. That is to say, in a regular sentence, in most languages, the assumption is that the most important part of the sentence is the verb. It's the action that is going on. And usually there are ways to make some part or another more important, but ultimately the focus is mostly going to be on the verb, and then on the subject, and then probably the object of the verb, and then adverbial elements behind all of that. The how, the why, the when something was done. In English, if you wanted to emphasize these elements, you can use tone. I want you home by 8 o'clock or something like that. You could perhaps put it at the front of the sentence, but in reality, it's mostly contextual, and there isn't a really established grammatical way to go about emphasizing an adverb. Middle Egyptian does have a way, and that is this second tense. It takes the focus off of the actual action that's happening and off of the doer of the action, the subject, and the recipient of the action, the direct object, and puts it on the everything else, the circumstances of the action, or the speed, or the state in which it was done. Anything like that, the Egyptians would use the second tense for. So the second tense, as I've mentioned, is a nominal form. That means that it does not use introductory particles, even though it can and does oftentimes form full sentences. Think back to the perspective form. You're going to find a lot of similarities with the respective. The meanings differ a good bit, but the grammatical appearance is going to be very similar. The big difference is that, unlike the perspective, the second tense can take on multiple different real tenses within it. This is part of what makes second tense so awful, is that there actually are two or more likely three genuine tenses, i.e. parts or forms of a verb that convey different types of time, but we just call it the second tense anyway, so just bear with me on this. There is a Sejm NF form. The Sejm NF form looks exactly like any other Sejm NF. So there's no gemination in geminating verbs, and you stick an N on the end and then the subject. Great, exactly what you'd expect. Looks exactly like a circumstantial, except if it's a main clause, it does not have a U preceding it. The present form, which is just Sejm F of the second tense, does have a recognizable feature, namely third weak verbs geminate. So marry, for example, to love, is a third weak verb. The Sejm NF form is mer NF, just one N, as we expect. But what's interesting is in this particular circumstance, it becomes, as the Sejm F form, instead of marry, it's merer. You double the second consonant. There's also probably a future form. Scholars argue on this, but I think the preponderance of evidence falls on there being a future second tense. It looks like the present, but it does not make any sense if you translate it into the present. Just translate it if you see a circumstance where it looks like the present, but it doesn't make any sense to be in the present, translate it as a future tense and argue as such if you need to. Another nice feature about the second tense is that the passive is really consistent. It is always formed with a to infix, just like the Sejm 2F passive of the circumstantial. There's no Sejm UF form that isn't marked. There is always a to there, TW just stuck in between the verb and the subject, including in the Sejm NF form, that will make it very obvious that you're dealing with a passive, which is great. One of the other things that's really helpful for recognizing a second tense, and I think probably the place where you are it's going to scream to you second tense immediately, and even in cases where it's not the main part of a sentence, where it's serving another role, is that the verbs of motion in a second tense use the Sejm NF form. As you will hopefully remember, there is no circumstantial past form for verbs of motion. The past tense is done in other ways. Most frequently, it is done with a stative form, or perhaps you could use other sort of like literary forms here and there, but you will never see a Sejm NF past form of a circumstantial. So you see Sejm NF, but for a verb of motion, so like Shem NF, for example, and you are certain that the NF does not mean to him or to whatever. It is definitely attached to the verb and is not a direct object, or an indirect object rather. Then you can be totally certain that you are dealing with a second tense form. And I can attest to you from several exams that I have taken, including the subject, that is a very helpful rule to remember, and it will make some sentences substantially easier to translate. The most common use of the second tense is something that gets called the explicatory sentence, which is kind of a weird way to put it. This is basically the equivalent of the U Sejm F statement of fact, but for second tense forms. So you have no introductory particle unless you're using mech for emphasis, rather than having the U. And then you have your verb, just as you'd expect. And then you have a subject, and if the verb means an object, you have the object. And then you have some adverbial comment. And that's exactly the same structure as what you would have with a statement of fact, the U Sejm F, except there's just no U. But otherwise, it will look very simple and familiar. What is different about it is that, as I mentioned, that adverbial comment becomes emphasized. It is the point of the sentence rather than incidental information about what is going on. And this can include anything that can function adverbially. That includes, of course, basic adverbs, like here or there. It can include prepositional phrases, which function as adverbs all the time. But it can also include entire circumstantial clauses, which have an adverbial function. That's the basic function of the Sejm F verb. Or it could include a stative form. Be particularly careful, as always, for stative forms in the third person that don't have endings. And you can have purpose clauses using the perspective CJMF or using the R plus infinitive. In either case, that whole clause becomes basically adverbial in function and can get stuck onto a second tense. And in all cases, you want to translate it so that as much as possible, the emphasis of your translation is on that adverbial comment at the end of the sentence rather than the beginning. For example, Hoke sometimes likes to just underline the adverbial comment. I think that's a perfectly fine way to do it. You can also play with word order and that kind of thing, but I like the underlining solution, frankly, for just practice translations, just so you know what's going on and can prove that. So we've got a couple examples of explicatory sentences that we have borrowed from the textbook. The first one, so the first part of our sentence is our subject and verb. Gem en sep weputiu. So gem en is just to find in the past tense, so found. Su is, it cannot be our subject because the subject would be a suffix pronoun, so we know this is an object. And then we find a word that we're proof was a subject after, weputiu, the messenger. So the messengers found him, and then our adverbial comment, which is a prepositional phrase, her waut, upon the road or on the road. Because the emphasis is meant to be on that second part, Hoke even translated as where the messengers found him, and then an underlined portion was on the road. That really makes it a very strong emphasis, I think. I think it works pretty well for these sorts of translations. And then our second one, now this is only part of the sentence. The sentence itself is quite long, and I didn't want to add in a bunch of extraneous information, but it's another one of Hoke's examples. Our first part, it begins with the thing I told you about, which is a verb of motion plus n. That really tells you immediately that we are dealing with a second tense form and therefore an explicatory sentence. Ii ni ii ni is I have come here. And then our adverbial comment is a purpose clause. And I think you could possibly argue that the is also part of the adverbial comment and therefore also should be emphasized, that I have come here in particular for this purpose in particular. But that's kind of hair splitting, I think. Our purpose clause is nis in order to summon ek you em weputu or weput. In order to summon you on a mission. And then it continues on. It's on a mission of my father, Khufu, the pharaoh, justified. But this is it was not necessary for the grammatical core of the sentence, but we get the same basic sense. And again, you'd want to underline that why I have come is in order to summon you on a mission. And in particular, adding that why and is, rather than just saying I have come here in order to summon you on a mission, also adds more emphasis and is another option you can use to make your translation a little closer to the original. Second tense forms, as we would expect from the perspective, and indeed as we would expect from nouns in general, can serve as objects of prepositions and direct objects of verbs. In either case, it retains this sort of sense of the way in which X was done. Very broadly, of course, you can play around with the precise wording of that, but that's always the sense. And oftentimes, it is easier to use question words here as before to create a sufficiently emphatic translation. So here we have another good example. Mer nf we rech ni kenen i. So this one translates, he loved me because he knew how brave I was. And this one is interesting because the first verb is a second tense. You'll notice it's not introduced, and it's emphasizing the circumstances under which something happened. In particular, it's telling you why he loved me. And the focus is not on the loving, but on the reasons for that loving. And then again, we get another second tense in kenen i. Notice the geminate for Kenny becoming kenen i. for to be brave. And the translation becomes how brave I was. The first verb here is just a circumstantial. He knew. So because he knew, kanen how brave I was. As opposed to, you could perhaps construct other translations if this is other forms of the verb, but the second tense makes it the emphasis on how brave from just the verb to be brave. There's a final use of the second tense that stems from what is oftentimes termed the A-B nominal sentence, where you just have two nominal elements directly pressed into one another, and you equate them together. Now, if you equate the circumstances under which two things happened, the result is a translation that means something like, just as this happened, so too that happened. Just as A, so B. And you can even go as far as putting entire explicatory sentences into this construction to add even more detail on the circumstances of how something took place. So here's our example. It comes from the Tale of Sinewy, rather famous work. Radi eni wat en redui emchej demi eni inbu heka. So our first part, Radi eni wat en redui emhej, which is it's sort of an idiom. I gave the road to my feet, emchej, going north, demi eni inbu heka. I reached the walls of the ruler. Now we know that the second one is a second tense form because to reach is a verb of motion, and therefore we couldn't really have it in without the second tense form with that n ending. So that that works. Oh, there's an omitted character here. I just noticed underneath demi there should be a seated man for a first person singular pronoun. And then given that, we can easily construct this as a reciprocal sentence, or a Wechselsatz, as it is apparently sometimes called. Just as I set out going north, I reached the walls of the ruler, or no sooner did I set out going forth than did I reach the walls of the ruler, etc., etc. There's lots of possible translations. The sense always remains the same. In conclusion, yeah, this was a shorter video. But this topic, I think, can easily trip people up, and I wanted to have a dedicated video for it, for people to come back to, etc. And this is the second last of the what we might call major verb forms. There will be more to say on verbs and more minor notes and that kind of thing, and a few less complicated forms of the verb. But this form, the second tense, and the relative are the two big ones that we have left. So I want each of them to have their own dedicated video. And then after that, we're going to go through chapters 11, 12, and 13 and kind of put together some of the miscellany that's going on in them. So we have, for example, a few minor verb forms like the sejem tef. We have questions. We have the imperative. All of that good stuff is coming up. But that is the end of our lecture. So thank you.